Up until now in this class, we've been talking mostly about fabrication, which is cutting, shaping, and joining metal. Now we're going to talk about a related technique that brings things to the next level, and that is forging. So forging is the use of some way to heat a metal, in other words, a forge, and then something to shape that heated metal, usually a hammer and anvil. Forging ends up having a different look than straight up fabricating does. It's often more organic, more homemade looking in appearance, and it can really provide a nice offset to a more mechanical looking steel rod. Forging can also create line quality. So if you remember back to your reading about line and you want to create thinner lines or jagged lines or something like that, forging can be really helpful for that purpose. You may also know forging by its kind of common name, which is blacksmithing. It's important to understand the techniques I'm going to show throughout the next few videos because you are going to be required to put at least one forged element in your Project 1 sculpture. For forging, we need some specific tools and equipment. First off, we need a forge, which in our case we're going to be using the oxyacetylene setups that we've been using for welding, just modified a little bit. I'll tell you how to do that later in this video. We are also going to need an anvil. There are a number of them of different sizes situated throughout the sculpture studio. For just a couple of different kinds of things, we'll need what's known as a quench bucket, which is just a bucket with water in it. There's usually one sitting around the studio. We're going to want our clear safety glasses, not our welding shades, but the clear glasses. We want a hammer of some kind. We have a whole variety of hammers here in the studio. You can find them on the shelf above the bolt cutters. You want to pick a hammer that feels comfortable to you in your hand and is a weight that you can handle pretty easily. A lot of people think you need a really heavy hammer for forging, but that's not the case because we're going to use gravity to our advantage. So we have a ball peen hammer here, which is good for more delicate sorts of shaping. We have a basic mallet, which is a good all-around tool. And then we have a cross peen hammer, which can be used for, again, some other types of shaping. It's a good idea to have a bolt cutters on hand. And I usually also have a couple of pliers handy just in case I need to grab a hold of something and bend it. And then finally, this funny piece of equipment right here is a torch holder. This is what we're going to use to set up our forge. You can find these on the shelf under the radio in the same place that the pipes are for fabricating, and I'll show you how to set that up. So you're familiar with turning on the oxyacetylene tanks. Just to review, remember our FOOF, so we're going to go one turn on with the acetylene, all the way with the oxygen. But one difference that's going to happen here is before we have turned this T valve to the right or clockwise until it says 5. For forging, we are actually going to turn it up until it says 10. So there's a little bit more gas coming into the line. On the oxygen, before we went from 0 to 20, this time we're going to go straight up to 20, just like that. Everything else is pretty much the same, so we turn on our Y valve a few turns to get it open. In this case, I'm using the blue handle, so I'll use the blue marked Y valve. There's one other very important thing we need to do for when we're forging, and that is we're actually going to use a different torch tip. The torch tips that we have been using for welding are a number 2 tip. Number 2 just refers to the size of the opening of the torch tip right here. We're going to want to use a number 4. So at the back of the torch carts in that little tray where you find your strikers, there's usually other torch tips in here, and you can potentially see the difference between the openings of the two. Most of them are also marked with a number, so this one says right here on the collar, number 4. To change the tip on one of these torches, you're going to want to hold the handle vertically and then unscrew the nut that holds it on. The reason we're holding it vertically and doing this pretty carefully is we don't want it to fall on the ground. This is soft metal and we can end up damaging the torch tip. We'll take our tip that we want to replace it with, fit it on, and screw it in place. When it gets close to tight, adjust it so that the torch is facing up relative to these two control knobs here. Make sure it's tightened down, and we've changed out the tip. The one that we're not using can go back in the basket. You need to make sure at the end of the day when you have been forging that you take the number 4 off and put your number 2 back on, because people tend not to check when they start welding, and if the wrong tip is on here, it can make it difficult for them. So be a good citizen of the studio and make sure you change this back to a number 2 when you're done. Let's talk about anvils for a moment. They actually have several parts to them. This front part is known as the horn, and it is used for shaping metal. We also have a little opening towards the back of the anvil called a hardy hole. This is a place in which you can put certain tools and forms against which you can shape metal. And then we have the main striking surface of the anvil too. Anvils actually have a sweet spot, and you can tell where the sweet spot is because it will ring less. So if I hit my hammer out here towards the end, you hear a very loud ring. If I get it more towards this area here, which on most of our anvils you see is pretty marked up, much less of a ring. To compare again, versus, so we want to hit most of the time right in the sweet spot. The last thing we need to do to get set up for forging is establish a place to put our forge or our torch. So for that you will need this funny little piece of equipment right here, which is a torch holder. You can find these under the radio in the same place that you find the various pipes that we were wrapping springs and jump rings on. You will also need a vise like this one here. To do this, you will place your torch holder in the vise at an angle with this straight piece at the bottom and the round piece more towards the top. Close your vise. Hammer it closed a little bit. Then you will take your torch on which you've put your number 4 tip, and the tip goes up through the little circle, and then the split right here between the 2 lines goes right on this peg here. Now we can light our torch to act as a forge. To do this, we're going to start the same way that we do for welding. So we'll turn our gas on just a little bit, gas only. Strike it so it lights. Remember, we're looking for the flame that is connected to the torch and straight, and then feathers out a little bit at the end. Once we've got that, we can start slowly putting in our oxygen. We're going to do something a little different with our torch or our flame for forging than we have done with welding. So with welding, you remember we wanted a neutral flame. We have those 3 cones, outer, middle, and inner, and we want the middle and inner to come together. For forging, we actually want the middle cone to be a little bit longer than the inner cone. That will create a flame that's got a little bit more fuel than it has oxygen. It's called a reducing flame, and it's just a bit better for forging. So it looks kind of like this. Okay, and from this point we'll be able to heat our metal and then take it over to our anvil and shape it. When you are setting up a space for forging or blacksmithing, you want everything to be in fairly close proximity. So you see my torch handle set up here and my tools that I need. I also have an anvil right here. We have a few anvils scattered throughout the studio. If you need to move one, here's how you do it. You're going to kind of lower the center of gravity, get a hand on either side, and then you're just going to walk it back to where you need it to be. These are very heavy. You want to take it slow so that you don't tip it over and injure yourself. If you need a quench bucket, that should also be in close proximity. Basically, you want everything nearby because you're going to be heating stuff up and then having this hot metal that you need to shape, and you don't want to be having to carry it across the studio. Not only is that not the very safest thing ever, but your metal will cool as it moves through the air. So you want to be able to get it from torch to anvil as quickly and as efficiently as possible.